I've been working the night shift as a security guard at a small office complex for the past 6 months. It's not exactly thrilling work, but the pay is decent, and the building is quiet enough that I can get some reading done during the long hours. Most nights are uneventful, just me, a stack of books, and the occasional check of the security cameras. That's how I like it. I never thought I'd end up being the protagonist in a story like this. The building has 4 floors, with a mix of offices and shared workspaces. It's in a suburban area, so the parking lot is surrounded by woods on 3 sides. The only other person in the building at night is the janitor, Maria, and we usually exchange pleasantries before she leaves around 1 a.m. After that, it's just me, alone in the silent building. The first time I noticed something was off was about 3 weeks ago. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds, checking that the office doors were locked and the lights were off. As I walked down the hallway on the 3rd floor, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't the first time I'd felt something like this, but I brushed it off as paranoia. The mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in a quiet place. As I turned the corner, I saw something that made me freeze. At the far end of the hallway, just outside one of the offices, a figure stood in the shadows. My heart jumped into my throat. I shone my flashlight in that direction, and the figure disappeared. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I finished my rounds quickly and headed back to the security desk to review the camera footage. Nothing. No sign of anyone in the building except for me. The next night, I tried to forget about it, but the unease lingered. Around the same time, 2 a.m., I heard a faint noise coming from the 3rd floor. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I reached the 3rd floor, the hallway was empty. I checked every office, even the supply closets, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, footsteps, this time coming from directly above me. The 4th floor is mostly unused, with a few empty offices and a small storage area. I rarely go up there during my rounds, but I had no choice. The footsteps were clear, echoing faintly in the silence. As I climbed the stairs, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something I'll never forget. One of the office doors was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The room was empty. No furniture, no equipment, just bare walls and a single overhead light that flickered intermittently. But on the floor, in the center of the room, was a small pile of papers. They were scattered as if someone had dropped them in a hurry. I knelt to examine them and felt my stomach churn. They were old photographs. Black and white, faded with time. Each one showed the same figure, a man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, standing in what looked like various parts of the office building. The most unsettling thing was that in every photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I took the photos to the security desk, intending to show them to my supervisor in the morning. But when I looked at the footage from the 4th floor, the room was empty. No light, no papers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Over the next few nights, the activity escalated. Doors that I'd locked during my rounds would be wide open when I returned. Objects on my desk would move when I wasn't looking. The sound of footsteps became a nightly occurrence, always leading me to the same empty room on the 4th floor. One night, as I reviewed the security footage, I caught something that made my blood run cold. In one of the cameras overlooking the parking lot, I saw him, the man from the photographs. He stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the lights. His face was blurry, but I could feel his eyes on me through the screen. I reported everything to my supervisor, but he dismissed it as a prank or a technical glitch. He said the photos were probably left behind by a previous tenant and told me to focus on my job. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The breaking point came 2 nights ago. It was just after 3 a.m., and I was sitting at the security desk, trying to distract myself with a book. Suddenly, every camera feed went dark. The monitors flickered, showing nothing but static. Then, one by one, the cameras came back on. On each screen, I saw the same thing, the men from the photographs, standing in different parts of the building. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the cameras. My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. He was getting closer. The last screen to come back was the one for the security desk. When it flickered on, he was there, standing just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the room was empty. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my things and ran, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. I quit the next morning. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But sometimes, late at night, I think I see him in my dreams, standing in the shadows, watching me. When I took the job as an overnight manager at a 24-hour grocery store, I thought it would be easy money. The store wasn't particularly busy during the day, and at night, it was practically deserted except for a handful of employees stocking shelves and cleaning up. I figured I'd spend most of my shifts on paperwork and overseeing the night crew, with the occasional late-night shopper wandering in. For the first month, that's exactly how it went. The most exciting thing that happened was breaking up a disagreement between two stockers over who got to use the last pallet jack. The quiet nights gave me plenty of time to think, but sometimes, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. I figured it was just my imagination. After all, there's something inherently eerie about being in a massive store at night, the aisles stretching endlessly under the fluorescent lights. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. It began with small, almost laughable occurrences. One night, I was walking down the cleaning supplies aisle during a routine check when I noticed a mop bucket in the middle of the floor. I assumed someone had left it there, so I wheeled it back to the storage room. When I returned, it was back in the same spot. I laughed it off, thinking maybe one of the employees was messing with me. But when I asked them, no one admitted to moving it, and their reaction seemed genuine. A few days later, I heard a faint noise coming from the frozen foods section. It was a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. I figured it was a loose panel in one of the freezers and went to investigate. But as I approached, the tapping stopped. When I opened the freezer door to check, I felt a blast of icy air and saw something strange, handprints on the inside of the glass. They were small, like a child's, but smeared, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass and then dragged them downward. That's when the unease began to set in. The real trouble started when I stayed late one morning to finish some paperwork. Most of the day crew had arrived, and the night crew had gone home, leaving me in the back office alone. The office was small, with a single desk, a filing cabinet, and a row of security monitors mounted on the wall. I glanced up at the monitors occasionally as I worked, keeping an eye on the store. Around 7 a.m., I noticed something odd on one of the screens. In the produce section, a figure was standing perfectly still between the apples and oranges. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a black hoodie. His back was to the camera, and he didn't seem to be shopping, just standing there, unmoving. I grabbed the intercom microphone and made an announcement. The store is now open for business. If you need assistance, please approach the front desk. The figure didn't move. I called one of the daytime employees over the radio and asked them to check the produce section. A few minutes later, they reported back. "No one's here," they said. "It's empty." Confused, I rewound the footage, only to find that the figure had disappeared in the seconds between when I saw him and when the employee arrived. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Employees reported hearing footsteps in empty aisles and strange whispers over the store's PA system. One stalker claimed she saw someone watching her from behind a shelf, but when she turned to confront them, no one was there. She quit the next day. I started reviewing the security footage more obsessively, trying to make sense of what was happening. On multiple occasions, I caught glimpses of the man in the hoodie, always in the corners of the cameras, always disappearing before anyone could see him in person. One night, I decided to stay late and catch him myself. I waited in the back office, watching the monitors, my phone ready to call the police at the first sign of him. Around 3 a.m., he appeared again, this time in the cereal aisle. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried out to confront him. When I reached the aisle, it was empty. But then I felt it, a cold breeze, unnatural and out of place in the warm store. It wasn't coming from the freezers or the air vents. It felt like it was following me, wrapping around me like icy fingers. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, whispering my name. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd experienced, afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. But I wasn't the only one noticing strange things. One of the janitors mentioned finding the same childlike handprints on the freezer doors every night, no matter how often he cleaned them. Another employee swore she saw someone standing in the stockroom, but when she turned on the light, it was empty. The final straw came a few nights later. I was in the stockroom, checking inventory, when the lights flickered and went out. I stood there in the pitch black, my heart pounding. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when I turned it on, I saw him, the man in the hoodie, standing at the far end of the stockroom. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but when I looked back, he was gone. I quit the next morning. Months later, I heard rumors about the store. Customers reported strange occurrences during late-night shopping trips, objects moving on their own, while suddenly plunging into darkness. One person claimed they saw a man in a black hoodie watching them from the end of an aisle, but when they approached, he vanished. I don't know what I encountered during my time there, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't human. Sometimes, when I walk past a grocery store late at night, I feel that same cold breeze and hear the faint echo of my name, whispered from somewhere I can't see. A few years ago, I took a night shift job at a factory that processed and packaged frozen foods. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and the hours fit my schedule. The factory was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and dense woods. By the time my shift started at 10 p.m., the place felt like a ghost town, with only a skeleton crew of about 10 people working the night shift. My job was simple: oversee the packaging machines, ensure everything ran smoothly, and document any issues for the daytime managers. Most nights were uneventful, just the hum of the machinery and the occasional small talk with co-workers. But the factory itself had a strange vibe, one I couldn't quite put into words. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows in the corners of the cavernous space, and the silence between machine cycles felt heavier than it should. It didn't take long for me to notice that something wasn't right. It started with the lights. Every night, around midnight, one of the overhead lights in the far corner of the factory would flicker and go out. At first, I thought it was a maintenance issue. I reported it to the daytime crew, but they said they couldn't find anything wrong. The bulb worked fine during the day, only failing during the night shift. A coworker named Eric joked that the factory was haunted. "This place has been around for over 50 years, he said one night as we stood by the machines. "You think no one's ever had an accident here? Places like this have history." I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. The idea of a haunted factory seemed ridiculous, but the flickering light wasn't the only strange thing happening. One night, I was walking through the storage area, checking inventory, when I noticed something odd. One of the large freezers, used to store pallets of frozen vegetables, was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been; those freezers were heavy and required significant force to open. I approached cautiously, feeling the blast of cold air as I pulled the door open wider. Inside, the pallets were stacked neatly, just as they should have been. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the frosted wall: handprints. They were small, like a child's, and smeared as if someone had been clawing at the ice. I called over one of my co-workers, a woman named Angela, to show her the prints. Her face went pale when she saw them. "That's not funny," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't put them there," I said. "I just found them." She shook her head. "I'm serious. Don't mess around about this. People say they've seen things here." When I pressed her for details, she refused to say more. She left the storage area quickly, leaving me alone with the freezing air and those haunting handprints. After that, I started paying closer attention to the strange occurrences. Doors that I knew I'd closed would be open when I walked by. Tools left on the workbenches would disappear, only to reappear in different parts of the factory. And then there were the shadows. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a trick of the light. I was in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee, when I noticed movement in the reflection of the window. It was subtle, like a dark shape darting past the machinery in the main floor. I turned quickly, but the factory was empty. From then on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just out of reach of the light, always disappearing when I turned to look. One night, around 3 a.m., the power went out. It wasn't uncommon for the factory to experience outages during storms, but that night the weather was calm. The machine stopped humming, and the only light came from the emergency backup fixtures near the exits. The factory was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I was in the middle of the main floor, surrounded by the towering machines, when I heard it, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing through the factory. My co-workers were all in the break room on the other side of the building, and the security cameras didn't cover this part of the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight around the room. The beam illuminated rows of machines and conveyor belts, but no people. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood in the shadows near one of the freezers. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. For a moment, I thought it was one of my co-workers playing a prank, but something about the way it moved, jerky and unnatural, made my blood run cold. "Who's there?" I demanded, taking a step closer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure remained still, its face obscured by the shadows. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the break room. My co-workers looked up in alarm as I burst through the door. "There's someone out there," I said, struggling to catch my breath. Angela's face went pale. "Did you see it?" I froze. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at the others before lowering her voice. "I've seen it too. The shadow. It's been here for years." I wanted to demand answers, but the lights flickered back on, and the machines roared to life. When we went back to the main floor, the figure was gone. The final straw came a few nights later. I was working alone, inspecting one of the machines, when I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. The voice came again, louder this time. "Leave now." I ran. I didn't bother clocking out or telling anyone, I just grabbed my things and drove home. I never went back to the factory, not even to collect my final paycheck. A few months later, I ran into Angela at a coffee shop. She told me the factory had shut down after a fire destroyed part of the building. No one was hurt, but the cause of the fire was never determined. Some of the workers claimed they saw a figure in the flames, a shadowy presence watching from the heart of the blaze. I don't know what I saw during my time there, but I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. Whatever was in that factory, it wanted to be left alone. And I'm more than happy to oblige. A few years ago, I worked the night shift as a nurse in a small-town hospital. The pay was decent, and the hours suited my schedule, but the building itself had always made me uneasy. It was old, built sometime in the 1940s, with creaking floors, dimly lit hallways, and long-forgotten wings that had been closed off decades ago. Still, I loved my job and the camaraderie of my co-workers. Most nights were quiet, with only a handful of patients in the wards. The hospital's third floor housed the active medical and surgical units, while the fourth floor was strictly off-limits. It had been shut down years ago due to structural issues, and no one was supposed to go up there. But even though the floor was closed, we all heard the rumors. Patients would ask about footsteps in the ceiling or the sound of carts being wheeled above them late at night. Some of the older nurses spoke in hushed tones about the woman in white, a figure they swore they'd seen lingering near the elevators or peeking into patients' rooms. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't deny the unease I felt when I was alone in the hallways. I told myself it was just the building's age, the creaks and groans of a structure past its prime. But that didn't explain what I experienced during my final month at the hospital. It started with a call light. One night, around 3 a.m., the call light for room 312 began flashing on the board at the nurse's station. I grabbed my chart and headed down the hallway, expecting to find a patient needing a blanket or pain medication. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the monitors were turned off, and the blinds were closed. Room 312 had been empty for weeks. I checked the panel by the bed to see if it had been accidentally triggered, but everything seemed fine. I turned off the call light and left the room, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine. When I got back to the nurse's station, I asked my coworker, Sarah, if she'd seen the light go off too. She nodded, looking just as puzzled as I felt. It's probably a wiring issue, she said. Happens all the time in old buildings like this. I wanted to believe her, but something about it didn't sit right. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. I'd hear faint whispers in empty hallways, the sound of a wheelchair squeaking down the corridor when no one was there. Once, while I was charting at the station, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, darting quickly across the far end of the hallway. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was all in my head. Night shifts mess with your perception, and sleep deprivation can play tricks on the mind. But then I started seeing her. It was a Thursday night, and I was doing my rounds when I caught a glimpse of someone standing at the end of the hallway. She was tall and slender, with long dark hair and a white hospital gown that hung loosely around her. Her back was to me, but something about her presence felt wrong. "Ma'am," I called out, stepping closer. "Are you lost?" She didn't respond. When I reached the spot where she'd been standing, the hallway was empty. My heart raced as I checked every room, expecting to find a confused patient or maybe even a prankster. But there was no one. When I told Sarah about it later, her face went pale. "That's her," she whispered. "The woman in white. I've seen her too." The turning point came 2 weeks later. It was another quiet night, and I was sitting at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee, trying to stay awake. Sarah had gone to check on a patient, leaving me alone with the dim hum of the monitors. Suddenly, the elevator dinged. I glanced up, confused. No one was scheduled to come in at this hour, and we rarely got visitors during the night shift. I watched the doors slide open, expecting to see one of the doctors or maybe even a lost visitor. The elevator was empty. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The doors stayed open longer than usual, as if waiting for someone to step inside. Then, without warning, they closed, and the elevator began ascending. To the 4th floor. I stood frozen, watching as the numbers on the panel climbed higher, 2, 3, 4. When it stopped, I heard the faint chime echoing through the stairwell. My stomach churned. No one was supposed to go up there. The floor was locked, the lights turned off, and the area completely inaccessible. But the elevator stayed there, its light glowing faintly on the panel. After what felt like an eternity, it began descending again, stopping at the 3rd floor. The doors opened. This time, the elevator wasn't empty. She stood there, her head tilted slightly, her dark hair hanging over her face. The white hospital gown she wore was stained and tattered, the fabric clinging to her gaunt frame. She didn't move, didn't step out of the elevator. She just stared at me. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, knocking over my coffee in the process. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had taken hold of me. When I blinked, she was gone. The elevator was empty again. I didn't finish my shift that night. I told Sarah I wasn't feeling well and left early, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel all the way home. I took a few days off, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I returned to work, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah pulled me aside as soon as I walked in, her face etched with worry. "It happened again," she said. "Room 312. The call light's been going off every night since you left. And last night, we heard her." I didn't want to know more, but Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She was crying. Just crying. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I lasted one more week at the hospital before I handed in my resignation. On my last night, I couldn't bring myself to finish my rounds. The call light for room 312 went off 3 times, and every time, I ignored it. When I left that morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, like I was abandoning something, or someone, who needed help. I never went back, but I still think about the woman in white, her shadowy figure lingering at the edges of my memory. I don't know who she was or why she was there, but I know one thing for certain: some places hold onto their history in ways we can't explain. And sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried,